Hello, my dears, and welcome to Creative Photo Folk, the home of creative photography. In a previous video, I showed you how to freeze motion using studio lighting by demonstrating with a dog catching treats. But what if you don't have studio lights? Well, that's what today's project is for, because we're going to photograph bursting water balloons using only a fast shutter speed. Now, it is always my preference to use studio lights for freezing motion because it allows you to freeze crisp detail in a way that a fast shutter speed can't. But sports or wildlife photographers rarely have the option of using lighting. So I wanted to give you a fun project that helps you practice using a fast shutter speed. For this project, you are going to need balloons, since they're our subject of choice. I tested 3 different types. The first was regular water balloons, but as these are designed to burst easily on impact, they were too difficult to handle without exploding. Then this cool contraption called Buncho balloons, which I'll link to below, that lets you fill many balloons at once. With these, you basically fill a bucket of water and then inflate them all at the same time with a hose. You then slide them off with your fingers and leave them sitting in the bucket until you're ready to use them. These lasted a bit longer than the other water balloons, but I'd still recommend using them as soon as you can. And finally, regular balloons. I found these to be the best as you can fill them with more water and they are larger, so they take up more of the frame, though they can be harder to burst. Next, you'll obviously need some water to fill the balloons. But be careful not to overfill them or they'll explode because they aren't strong enough to support the weight. So it can take some experimenting to get this right. You also obviously need to be comfortable with wasting water. You can change the colour of the water if you like, using food colouring or milk, but I chose just to use plain water. You can also try filling the balloon with smoke, powder, or flour, but I'd probably reserve these for shooting with studio lights. You'll need an assistant to hold and burst your balloons, who is willing to get a little wet. You can also tie the balloons with string or fishing line to something like a clothes rack if you'd prefer to burst them yourself, but I found this too time-consuming and a bit fiddly. Though it's difficult to burst the balloon and trigger the camera at the right time if you are doing this alone, unless you have some kind of sound trigger, like a Pluto or Myops, which I'll talk more about later. Finally, you'll need something to burst your balloons, like a needle. To prevent seeing hands in your shot, the longer the burster, the better. We use long needles, but you could also use a long piece of wire, cake tester, dart, or pellet gun. To be able to use high enough shutter speeds, you are also going to need a lot of light. So I suggest shooting outdoors on a very bright day, ideally around midday when the sun is high. The best location to shoot in that avoids background distractions is an area of extreme contrast, so that your balloon is in direct sunlight while the background is shaded. I chose to use the shade of this tree in my backyard, and my assistant stood right at the edge in the sun. But make sure to wear sunscreen. Also check that your assistant is positioned in a way that they're not casting too much shadow on the balloons with their body. Now, I had to shoot this twice because I wasn't happy with the first set of results. It's also why this video is late. And that's because even with these conditions, the background was too distracting, though I could fix it a little by dragging down the black slider in Lightroom. So the second time I shot it, I set up a backdrop stand with a black roller blind, which worked much better. If you don't have this option, you can just position your subject in front of some greenery like grass with your camera tilted down, but put some distance between the balloon and your background to blur it out. I recommend using a longer lens like a 70-200 so that you're far enough away from the action to avoid your camera getting splashed. However, if you're using smaller balloons, you may prefer to use something like a 2470 just so you can get that bit closer with your focus. I used a tripod more often than not, just to keep the framing roughly the same each time. You'll want to use as fast a shutter speed as you can manage, but this is going to cut a lot of light. So to compensate, aim for a wider aperture or a higher ISO, maybe both. I used 1/3200th of a second, f9 for a bit more depth, and an ISO of 640. The goal is to see how high you can get your shutter speed while still maintaining a good exposure on the subject in the sun. If using a dark background, make sure to take a test shot and check that it is fully dark before you start shooting. Frame your shot with the balloon at the top and leave extra space to capture the falling splash. I used a portrait orientation the majority of the time. Set your camera to high speed continuous so you can capture several shots of each bursting balloon. To avoid the camera trying to refocus for every shot, I recommend using back button focus or manual so you can easily find focus and keep it locked throughout. Focus will make or break your shot, so it's really important to get this right. I refocused on the balloon each time, and still some weren't in focus. To get your timing right, count your assistant down from 3 to 1. Though I suggest you start shooting on 2, and then keep your finger on the shutter to capture a series of shots using burst mode. Maybe that's why they call this burst mode. Now, I also tried using a Pluto sound trigger so I could hold the balloons myself and use the sound of the bursting balloon to trigger the camera. However, the burst sound did not trigger it, only the sound of the water hitting the ground. It suggested that filling the balloon with both water and a little extra air will create a more definite pop sound, but I didn't end up trying this because I figure most people won't have a trigger anyway. Now, splashes are fun, but not super interesting. So you might like to try including something that gives the shot some context, like showing the hand holding the balloon as it pops, seeing a dart or pellet entering it, or putting on a pair of glasses or a hat on the balloon. Though our balloons were always too small to keep the glasses in place, even when filled to capacity, so child-size items might be best. Though we did manage to capture this shot, which was the winner of the day. And quite unlike our other shots, as usually you need high-speed lighting to capture something like this. And if this is something you'd like to learn, then inside Photo Fanatics, our next monthly creative class will show you how to freeze liquid with flash using examples like water drops, paint in water, splashes, and milk dresses. So that's how to shoot high-speed bursting balloons using only a fast shutter. This is a perfect project for a hot day and a fun one to try with the kids. Once you've given it a go, pop on over to my Facebook group, linked below, and share your results and show us how wet you got. Until next time, happy creating.